In the decade after the Second World War, Japan conducted the most comprehensive survey of its own geography in its history. American occupation authorities required it. Japanese scientific institutions conducted it. The results went into government files in the early 1950s and have remained there in various states of classification, restriction, and institutional non-disclosure ever since. Some of what was found has been quietly incorporated into policy decisions, building regulations, maritime navigation protocols, emergency management frameworks, without the underlying data being made public. Some of what was found has informed decisions about where to build and where not to build, without the reasons for those decisions being explained to the people affected by them. In this video, we count down 13 things Japan has known about its own geography since the 1950s that have never been published. Stay with me to the end, because number one directly affects where millions of people currently live, and they have not been told. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let us begin. Japan's post-war geographic survey documented the precise locations of small island formations in the East China Sea and the Sea of Japan that do not appear on any public navigational chart published since 1952. The survey data exists in Maritime Safety Agency archives. The islands it documents are absent from public cartography. The disappearance of these formations from public maps coincides with the establishment of territorial boundary frameworks in the post-war period. Their absence from public cartography affects the calculation of Japan's exclusive economic zone in ways that the public calculation, based on publicly available maps, does not reflect. Separately, Japan's actual seabed topography in its territorial waters, documented in surveys conducted jointly with American naval hydrographers between 1947 and 1955, differs in specific locations from the publicly available seabed maps. The differences occur at depths and locations relevant to submarine navigation. Japan's post-war geological survey produced fault line mapping that differed from the publicly released fault line data in specific locations. The differences were not in remote or uninhabited areas. They were in locations where development occurred in the decades following the survey, locations where the survey documented fault line positions would have affected construction decisions if the survey data had been incorporated into public planning frameworks. The publicly available fault line maps that governed construction permits in Japan from the 1950s through the 1990s underrepresented active fault positions in specific urban development corridors. This is documented in post-earthquake damage assessments that identified damage patterns inconsistent with the publicly available fault line maps and consistent with the more detailed survey data held in government geological archives. The gap between survey-documented fault positions and publicly available fault mapping has been partially addressed in revisions made since the 1995 Kobe earthquake. The original survey data has not been publicly released. Japan's post-war nuclear program, beginning with American-supervised atomic research facilities in the late 1940s, produced baseline radiation measurements for specific geographic areas of Japan that have not been published in any public scientific registry. These baseline measurements, conducted before Japan's civilian nuclear power program began in the 1960s, established pre-nuclear industry radiation levels for areas that subsequently hosted nuclear power facilities. The significance of these pre-industry baseline measurements is that they provide the comparison point against which post-accident radiation increases would be measured. In the absence of published baseline data, post-accident radiation levels cannot be accurately compared to pre-industry conditions using publicly available data. Following the 2011 Fukushima Daiichi accident, the question of pre-industry baseline radiation levels in affected areas became specifically relevant to public health assessments. The 1950s baseline measurement data has not been released for this purpose. The assessments proceed without it. Japan's post-war hydrographic surveys documented submarine volcanic activity in the waters surrounding the Japanese archipelago at levels and in locations not reflected in any public volcanic hazard assessment published before 2000. The survey data, collected by research vessels conducting systematic depth soundings and temperature measurements in the late 1940s and 1950s, identified active submarine volcanic systems, whose surface manifestations, temperature anomalies, gas emissions, periodic seafloor elevation changes were documented in survey records held by the Japan Meteorological Agency. The submarine volcanic activity documented in these surveys was relevant to maritime navigation, to the stability of undersea cable infrastructure, and to the long-term geological stability of specific island formations. Maritime routing protocols for Japanese waters incorporate information consistent with the survey data without referencing the survey data as their source. The survey documentation itself has not been published. The protocols informed by it are public. The reasons for the protocols are not explained. Japan's post-war geological surveys produced landslide risk assessments for mountainous regions that differed significantly from the publicly available risk classifications used in planning and development decisions from the 1950s through the 1980s. The survey documented high-risk areas, included locations that were subsequently developed for residential use under planning frameworks that used the lower-risk public classifications. Post-disaster assessments following major Japanese landslide events in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s consistently identified damage concentrated in areas whose actual risk levels were documented in the 1950s survey data and not reflected in the public classifications that permitted their development. The 2000 Sediment Disaster Prevention Law introduced new risk classification frameworks that partially address the gap between actual and publicly classified risk levels. The 1950s survey documentation that established the actual risk levels has not been made part of the public record accompanying the new framework. Japan's post-war hydrological surveys documented underground freshwater reservoir systems whose scale and distribution differed significantly from the publicly available hydrological data used in water resource planning. The surveys, conducted partly under American occupation resource assessment requirements, identified major subsurface aquifer systems in specific regions whose capacity was substantially larger than publicly recognized. The significance of this data is two-directional. In water-scarce planning contexts, knowledge of the actual aquifer capacity would have informed different infrastructure investment decisions. In contamination risk contexts, knowledge of the aquifer distribution would have informed different industrial and agricultural location decisions. Post-industrial contamination events in Japan since the 1960s have produced specific patterns of groundwater contamination, whose spread corresponded more closely to the 1950s. Survey documented aquifer distribution than to the publicly available hydrological maps used in contamination assessment. The survey documentation has not been released for contamination assessment purposes. Japan's post-war coastal surveys documented erosion rates for specific sections of the Japanese coastline that exceeded the publicly communicated rates used in coastal development planning. The survey data, compiled by the Ministry of Construction's predecessor agencies in the early 1950s, established erosion baseline measurements for coastal sections that were subsequently developed for residential, commercial, and industrial use. The publicly communicated erosion rates used in coastal planning. From the 1950s through the 1990s, understated actual erosion velocities in specific sections documented in the survey data. Development permits for coastal areas were issued under planning. Frameworks that use the lower publicly communicated rates. Coastal land loss patterns documented since the 1990s in affected sections have corresponded more closely to the survey documented erosion rates than to the public planning figures. The survey documentation has not been incorporated into the public coastal management record, despite its demonstrated accuracy. Japan's post-war seismological surveys identified specific geographic zones characterized by the absence of seismic activity in areas surrounded by active seismic zones. These seismic gap zones, areas that have not released accumulated tectonic stress through earthquake activity, were documented in survey data held by the Japan Meteorological Agency from the early 1950s. The seismic gap zones documented in the 1950s surveys include areas where the absence of recent earthquake activity indicates not geological stability, but accumulated stress awaiting release. The distinction between stable geology and stressed but quiet geology is critical to infrastructure siting decisions. Infrastructure developed in seismic gap zones from the 1950s through the 1990s was sited under planning frameworks that treated the absence of recent earthquake activity as evidence of geological stability rather than as the accumulated stress pattern the survey data documented. The survey documentation has not been publicly released, despite its relevance to ongoing infrastructure siting decisions. Japan's post-war oceanographic surveys documented persistent ocean temperature anomalies in specific sections of waters surrounding Japan that have not been incorporated into any public oceanographic record. The anomalies areas where sea temperature at specific depths consistently deviates from the surrounding water temperature in ways that cannot be attributed to known current patterns or submarine geothermal activity were first documented in systematic measurements conducted in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The anomalies are relevant to fisheries management because fish population distribution responds to temperature differentials. The fishing quotas and zone designations that Japan has maintained since the 1950s incorporate information consistent with the survey-documented anomalies without referencing the anomaly data as their basis. The anomaly documentation has also been relevant to submarine navigation. The thermal layers created by the anomalies affect acoustic conditions in ways relevant to sonar operation. Japan's post-war geological surveys documented an extensive cave and tunnel system network in the limestone regions of Yamaguchi, Okinawa, and Iwate prefectures that substantially exceeds the publicly known cave extent. The survey documentation, which included military assessments of underground spaces suitable for infrastructure use, has remained in restricted archives since the early 1950s. The cave systems documented in the surveys were assessed for military utility during the occupation period, and the assessments were incorporated into American military planning documents. The Japanese government subsequently inherited both the survey data and the restriction on its publication. The publicly accessible cave systems in the documented regions represent a fraction of the total underground extent surveyed. The entrances to documented but publicly unknown cave sections have in several cases been incorporated into surface development in ways that the public record does not acknowledge. Japan's post-war geological surveys produced dating assessments for the rock formations of contested island groups, particularly the Senkaku/Diaoyu Islands and the southern Kuril Islands, that differ from the publicly maintained geological descriptions in ways relevant to territorial and resource rights arguments. The geological age and formation history of island rocks affects the legal and diplomatic arguments about territorial sovereignty and resource rights in international maritime law frameworks. The survey documented geological data for specific contested island formations has remained in restricted government archives since the early 1950s. The publicly maintained geological descriptions of these islands in Japanese government communications have been consistent across decades. The survey documentation that may differ from these descriptions has not been released to independent researchers. Japan's positions in territorial disputes are argued from publicly available geological data. The 1950s survey data for the disputed formations has not contributed to the public record of those arguments. The most significant geographic finding that Japan has known since the 1950s and has not published is a subsidence assessment for specific sections of Japan's most densely populated urban areas. The assessment, conducted by the post-war survey program, documented the rate at which specific sections of Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya were sinking not from groundwater extraction, which is publicly documented, but from geological compaction of the sedimentary layers on which these cities were built. The geological compaction subsidence documented in the 1950s surveys differs from the extraction-related subsidence in one critical respect. It cannot be stopped by reducing groundwater extraction. It is the response of deep sedimentary layers to the weight placed on them. It continues regardless of what is done above ground. The survey documented compaction subsidence rates for specific sections of Japan's major urban centers have not been incorporated into any public planning document. The sections affected are among the most densely developed in the world. The people living there have not been told.